It's a pleasure to be here. There are a lot of people in the back, and there are some seats along the sides down here, a couple towards the middle. So if you want to come closer, these are more expensive seats, but we give them away at a bargain just for people who arrive late. I also wanted to particularly welcome some students who are with us this evening from Jones College Prep. I think they're in the back, and we're not going to make you put up your hands because we don't want to embarrass you, but delighted to have you here. I'll be meeting with a lot of you tomorrow, so part of my visit is to have a chance to get to know some of the not only very talented people here at Northwestern, but talented people from the next generation in the community, so I'm looking forward to that. When Greg asked me to come here to do what is intended to be a really general public lecture, I was not sure exactly what best to talk about, but I thought that I would focus on this topic of mental illness because it is something we don't talk enough about. All of us have experience, either because we know someone or because we ourselves have struggled with one of the disorders of interest: depression, schizophrenia, PTSD, phobias, bipolar illness, borderline, anorexia. There's just a whole range of mental disorders. And the bottom line of what I want to tell you tonight is that we're in the middle of a revolution in the way we think about these. And this revolution is not well known. It's not fully appreciated, I think, by even people in the profession, but it's long overdue. And what I'd like to do over the next 40 minutes or so is to give you some picture of what that revolution is going to look like as it begins to unfold over the next few years. But I want to start by talking to you about that topic that really all of these lectures are built around, which is the importance of research, and to point out that research has really transformed outcomes for a lot of people with serious medical illnesses. So cardiovascular disease is an example we often use, where there's about a 65% reduction in mortality over the last 40 or 50 years. That means about 1 million deaths averted. That's 1 million people who are alive today who would not have been based on the history of cardiovascular disease. A lot of those 1 million people are voting in primaries today, and let's hope that they actually support more funds for biomedical research, because the only reason they're voting is because of insights that have come from this kind of work. It's not only cardiovascular disease, but also cancer, where we've seen for the first time a change in mortality. We've seen that what used to be the largest killer in this country is no longer that. That more people are actually living with cancer than ever before. I think the number is now well beyond 10 million, a figure that was surpassed in 2003. So it's not just heart disease and cancer. You can look at acute treatments for stroke, where some 30% of people who previously would have had disability come into the emergency room. They're treated quickly if they're seen within a few hours, 2 to 3 hours of the onset, and they leave the emergency room without any disability. 15 years ago, a diagnosis of HIV meant you had a life expectancy measured in months. Today, a 19-year-old with an HIV infection will probably live to at least age 69 and 70, possibly dying of something completely different. So these are really extraordinary advances that have happened in our lifetimes, some of which are due to changes in public health, some in changes in policy, but often trace back to discoveries that come from biomedical research. In contrast to those extraordinary successes, where are we for mental disorders? Not so good there. Diagnosis here is entirely by observation, which is quite different than what you'd have in the rest of medicine. We get to the scene quite late. Our ability to predict who is likely to get ill is actually fairly weak. In contrast to many areas of medicine, we don't really have a good sense of what the causes are for most mental disorders. And as a result, we don't have a good program of prevention, though we talk about it our ability to prevent autism, prevent schizophrenia, prevent bipolar disorder is just not up to par with what you'd expect in the rest of medicine. Treatments that we have are mostly by trial and error. This is one of the very few areas of medicine where we don't even talk about developing cures, though we do for most areas. And it's one of the very few areas where we don't have much in the way of vaccine development. Bottom line for me is that in contrast to what I just told you about for other areas, here we've got a prevalence that's not really gone down, as far as I can tell, for any illness. In fact, it's probably gone up for most of them. And there's no sign that mortality has decreased for any illness. So it's very different from the picture of a 63% reduction in cardiovascular mortality or about the 10 to 15% reduction in deaths from cancer. Now, sometimes when I show people that kind of a slide, besides being a little depressed, people say, yeah, but these are just mental disorders. So why we're not really talking about the same kind of problems. These are behavioral problems after all. They're not really serious medical problems. So take a look at how we think about this in terms of the data, and we'll go through some numbers. If you look at what causes the most medical disability, that is, what takes people out of the workforce, what takes people out of school, what is disabling from medical illnesses, it's actually not the things that kill you, it's often the things that are chronic. And now we talk about neuropsychiatric disorders, the ones I mentioned before, depression, schizophrenia, bipolar, a whole series of these, as being the largest source of disability of all medical causes. About 30%, almost 30% of the disability from everything that's medical can be comprised by this group, small group of disorders. When people see this, they say, it doesn't make sense because they don't seem that serious. Well, they are serious. They're disabling. They start early in life, so that has a huge impact. And they're chronic, or at least episodic. But it's not just that they cause disability, or what we call morbidity, which is the public health term for disability. It's also that they're a major source of mortality, which really surprises people. About 36,000 suicides every year in this country. That means in the hour that we're talking here, there'll be 4 suicides in the United States. It's an extraordinary figure. Most of those are related to mental illness. And just to give you some perspective, that's more than twice the number of homicides, more than the number of traffic fatalities. That's an amazing number. And you wouldn't expect it from reading the morning paper or watching the evening news, where you hear a lot about traffic fatalities and homicides. But in fact, suicide is twice as common as homicide. And even more worrisome, the rates of homicide have come down. So this wasn't always true. Homicides have actually reduced about 40%, as have traffic fatalities. Suicides, if anything, have slightly increased over the last 2 decades. And I wish that that was the worst of it. It's not. Actually, it gets worse. And the worst part is that for those people who don't die of suicide, they die of other causes very early. So the life expectancy for people with serious mental illness is about 23 to 25 years shorter than it should be for those without in this country. So this is a huge health disparity based entirely on whether you have a mental illness. In this case, not because of suicide, but most commonly chronic pulmonary disease, because 44% of cigarettes smoked in the United States are smoked by the 3 to 4% of people with serious mental illness. It's extraordinary. Cardiovascular disease, severe obesity, a whole range of problems that complicate having schizophrenia, bipolar illness, and other serious illnesses like this. So this is a huge, huge public health dilemma. It's worse than that as well, because it's also a large economic problem for this country. And since this is an election year, and because we're going to be talking a lot about healthcare and about the cost of healthcare and about economic development and recovering from a recession, you've got to see these numbers. These are numbers put together by the World Economic Forum, looking at the costs of chronic non-communicable diseases. The World Economic Forum is the group that holds the meeting in Davos every year. It's mostly made up of economists, but they're interested in what it takes for countries to develop and what it takes for developed countries to remain competitive. And so about a year ago, they came together as a small group led by David Bloom in the School of Public Health at Harvard to say, how does the wealth of nations affect the health of nations, and how does the health of nations impair the wealth of nations? And the way they looked at this was they used several different models, and they divided up, as you can see on this graph, high income, upper middle, and lower middle income countries, low income countries. But no matter how they looked at it, they ended up with the same really unexpected finding, and that was that mental illnesses of all the chronic non-communicable diseases were the largest drivers of costs. And that didn't matter whether you were in a high-income or a low-income country. These were problems that one will have to deal with as public health problems, but also as development and economic problems if we're going to be able to see low-income countries become competitive, and if high-income countries are going to continue to be competitive. So we got a problem. We've got a series of illnesses that cause enormous morbidity, mortality, enormous costs, and we're not doing very well by them. And so what I want to talk to you about is how we get to from where we are, because whatever we've been doing has gotten us to this point. So that's not what we want to continue doing. We have to be thinking about these in a very different way. And what I'm going to suggest to you is ways that we can rethink this problem so that we can hope to see some better solutions. So I'll lay this out and we can talk about it in a variety of ways. What we'll start with is just some very simple suggestions of ways to take the same problem and think about it with some new approaches. The first is to say, and maybe this isn't so revolutionary, but to suggest that these are brain disorders. That's not to say that they're like Parkinson's disease or ALS or multiple sclerosis where you have a brain lesion, because we don't know that there's a lesion here, but that these can be studied as disorders of brain circuitry, brain function. And that means something because we now have the tools to do that. These are developmental disorders, easily misunderstood, but that makes them quite different from other medical illnesses and most neurological illnesses, which tend to happen late in life. These are maybe all neurodevelopmental. An epidemiological study done for us about a decade ago, as a kind of general population survey, looked at the onset of common mental illnesses or mental disorders. 50% of patients described onset, and these weren't even patients, so 50% of people who coded positive for having a disorder, 50% noted onset by age 14, 75% by age 24. That's very different than cancer, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, go down the list. And that's part of why you have the large expense and you have the large disability. These are developmental disorders. And finally, apropos of what our hosts are most interested in, these are complex genetic disorders due to both genetic factors and experiential factors, which we're now beginning to understand in a very different way. So we've got a much better sense of what that means. Let's unpack each of these, and let me just tell you a little bit in terms of why I think that these are game changers if we do them and understand them in the right way. We'll start with thinking about these as brain disorders, and the important thing for you to know there is that we now have the tools to be able to look at this with great precision. So in the last 2 decades, we've gone from thinking about the brain as a black box where maybe you've got what we used to call a chemical imbalance, which is really an embarrassingly ignorant thing to say, to now having an ability to study the brain in the way that we study any other organ of the body. We can be able to look at this, as you can see here, by studying structural connectivity, functional connectivity, temporal connectivity, a whole range of very powerful tools that allow us to look at what's different in the brain of somebody who's psychotic and having hallucinations from somebody who isn't. How does the brain develop? What are the effects of experience on that process? What's the normal individual variation to the way that areas are connected together, the connectome, which is the wiring diagram of the human brain? And having that information has already begun to give us the maps of what these disorders look like from the perspective of brain circuits. Just one example, as you look at this particular picture, is a picture of areas that seem to be involved in major depressive disorder, a mood disorder. And it's not as simple as having a single area affected. It's a whole range of circuits with many different nodes that seem to be involved. Importantly, this circuit looks different than the circuit for PTSD, or the circuit for schizophrenia, or the circuit for autism. But in each of those cases, we're beginning to understand what the underlying brain architecture has to be. And it then raises questions about how that happens. What are the effects of genes of experience? How does that happen across development? In the case of depression, the picture we have today looks very different than the picture that I was taught when I was in training. I was taught that depression is rage turned against the self, and it probably is. But that's only one level of understanding depression. There was a period where we thought of depression as a chemical imbalance, which, as I mentioned before, is a very difficult idea to prove or disprove. The picture we have today looks much more like this map, almost like a subway map, but that's because it has many different brain areas involved, because depression is a very complex syndrome with many different aspects to it, some of which have to do with mood, some have to do with thinking, some have to do with insight, and some have to do with somatic or vegetative or interoceptive symptoms like hunger, sex drive, sleep disturbances, all of those things. The point of this map is that each of those is subserved by different nodes in this network, and that's important for two reasons. One is that the treatments we have may enter through different parts of the network. So medications may work in one area, cognitive behavior therapy may work more on the cortical pieces of this, and this new treatment that you may have heard about, deep brain stimulation, which was borrowed from Parkinson's disease, where you actually put an electrode into the brain, into one of these nodes, and change its activity, just like you were treating an arrhythmia. And you can get people with treatment-refractory depression to respond very, very quickly. It's a very profound effect. And so an amazing proof of principle of this kind of an approach. All of those suggest that different treatments may work through different gateways here. And the second piece of that we have to remember is that depression is many different disorders, and that each individual may have different parts of this circuitry, different nodes that are going to be most affected. So understanding these kinds of approaches, that is letting the brain tell us what this disorder actually is, in the same way we would do for cardiology, where we let the heart tell us where is the ischemia, or cancer, where we let molecular diagnostics tell us what is the lesion. Beginning to do that from the brain as well as from the observable behavior helps us to guide treatments in a way that become much more specific and potentially more effective. Developmental disorders. I already told you that in that epidemiological study, there's early onset to 50% by age 14. But if you look at the range of disorders we're talking about today, anxiety, mood, schizophrenia, I've mentioned all of these almost, panic disorder, bipolar, substance abuse, eating disorders, you can see the array at which, about the time when these emerge. And it's important to remember that that's across that time frame, you still have brain development taking place. Raises the question about whether the age of onset has something to do with what brain circuits are emerging or maturing just at that point. It also suggests that if you have an illness that affects the brain, you may affect subsequent development, because after all, this is a trajectory. And when something happens, an insult or a severe illness, across that period of trajectory, it's not only a cause, but it's an effect. or it's not only an effect from something that may have already happened, but it can be a cause of subsequent effects. That's just a kind of implicit from this slide. It's worth remembering that we used to, when I was in school, I was taught that most of brain development is finished by age 3. And as this makes very clear, the cortex, particularly prefrontal cortex, continues to develop right through adolescence, right into early 20s. Jay Geed, who is responsible for this work from NIMH, was presenting this and was very proud. This was a project he worked on for years to do a longitudinal study of brain development. He was presenting this in a public lecture somewhat like this, and someone at the back of the room afterwards said, you know, I get the fact that you're saying that you've discovered that brain development continues right through to age 25. I work for Hertz. I could have told you that a long time ago, because we don't rent to anyone under 25. So it's nice to have the data, but actually someone had figured that out behaviorally long before we got there. Let me give you a sense of why thinking about this developmentally can really make a difference. And it's one way of sort of rethinking these disorders. When we talk about schizophrenia, we understand that schizophrenia is an illness which has psychosis. And the psychosis usually starts about between ages 18 and 23. That's when you first see the hallucinations, delusions, severe changes in thought and behavior. We don't actually know what is changing in the brain at that time, but our best ideas have followed sort of 3 tracks. One is that there's a change that takes place over a long period of time as a deficit in the way that white matter tracks are forming in the brain. White matter is what connects brain areas. And one idea is that the wiring is insufficient. Another idea is that the excitatory pathways are not being pruned in the right way, in the way that they should be. And so that you end up with too many excitatory synapses in the prefrontal cortex. And another is that there's a deficit in inhibitory pathways or inhibitory synapses. It's possible, by the way, that each of those is right, but for different people, that schizophrenia is many diseases, and that for some people it can be more excitatory and some more inhibitory. We don't know that. These are hard questions to answer, but we're beginning to get pictures of this as we now have better tools to look at not only what's happening in the brain, but what's happening in the brain over development. But implicit in this kind of an approach is that when you've got someone who has a psychotic break at age 18, that's not the beginning of the illness. That's an endpoint. That a lot has been going on before that. And arguably, one reason why we haven't done as well as we would like for people who have this thing we call schizophrenia is because we get involved very late in the game. Imagine if we only treated cardiovascular disease after people had a heart attack. We wouldn't do very well there either. And the trick for cardiovascular disease, or cancer for that matter, is beginning to understand that those most serious events, like a heart attack, is the end stage of a long process that started many years before. So what we've begun to do is what's already happened in many other areas of medicine, is to stage this illness. Because if it's developmental, you can begin to think about it in stages. The psychotic experience at age 18 is stage 3, not stage 1. Stage 4 is where most people end up in the healthcare system with a chronic illness that's very difficult to manage. But the future, if we really want to reduce morbidity and mortality, is to move upstream and to look at stages 1, which is stage of risk, which we're just beginning to understand, and stage 2, which we call the prodrome, a time when a 14-year-old may not have psychosis, but may have odd ideas, may be becoming more socially withdrawn, having problems with concentration, not doing as well in school, and beginning on this trajectory, which we have not yet been able to clearly define. But of course, we never will unless we begin to look at it that way, and we begin to think about it that way. And then ultimately begin to think about how to change that trajectory and how to build resilience in, rather than allowing this young person to go on to this stage of chronic illness. Okay, complex genetic risk plus experiential factors. That's really not that surprising. It would be hard to argue that almost any medical disease would be anything other than that. But I wanted to take this as an opportunity to just give you a quick, sort of a fast course in how we think about the problem. First point to make is that there's every reason to be interested in genetics when we think about autism, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. This is a table or a graph that shows what we call concordance. That is the likelihood that if you study twins and they're monozygotic twins that share 100% of their DNA, if one twin has the disorder, the other one will have it. So the dark bar shows you what happens at the top with one twin here having autism. What's the likelihood that his or her co-twin will have autism? And you can see it's about 70%. If it's a dizygotic twin, meaning they only share 50% of their DNA, they're fraternal twins, it's much, much lower. Actually, this number has probably now been, it's closer to 20%. This is an old slide, but in any case, it's way below the MZ dark bar. And you can see for bipolar, schizophrenia, there is clearly something that comes about from sharing your genetic material. So 100% DNA similarity means that you're more likely to share the disease, and that suggests heritability, or at least suggests that there's a genetic factor at work. Not so much for major depressive disorder, but you can see that for these three, it's very much in line with other medical complex genetic diseases like Crohn's disease, hypertension, type 1 diabetes. Major depressive disorder. Okay. So a quick course in genetics. For all of you, when you think about genetics, you're thinking mostly about diseases that are very rare, like Huntington's disease or cystic fibrosis or what we call Mendelian diseases. They affect less than 1% or 0.1% of the population. So like 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000 here. But if you have the mutation, you have the disease. And that's kind of the way we've thought about genetics for the last 3 or 4 decades at least. It's becoming clear that there are lots of other variations in the genome. They're not causal, but they confer risk. So they may be more common, affecting perhaps 1 in 100 people, 1% of the population. But we call it penetrance. It really means risk, or what's the likelihood that if you have the genetic variation, you're going to develop the disorder. And here you can see that they confer a certain amount of risk, but they don't. Just because you have one of these doesn't mean that in the case of BRCA1, you will definitely get breast cancer or ovarian cancer. ApoE4 increases your risk for Alzheimer's by 15-fold, but not everybody who has it is going to develop Alzheimer's. In addition, we've begun to realize that when you look at the genome, there's just an enormous amount of variation in the genome, and more than any of us had dreamt of. And so we've begun to realize that there also are these very common variants that actually may be associated with disorder, but confer a very small amount of risk. And so this is a way of sort of thinking about how do you link the genome to disease. And you can imagine, it's also possible you could have very high and very common variants, but those would all be very quickly taken out of the gene pool, so they wouldn't last. And there are probably a lot of very rare and kind of low penetrant mutations that nobody would know about, nobody would care about. So these three, though, these on this axis are probably where you want to be. Just a second here. I should mention, I skipped over this one when my screen went dark, that for those of you who are new to this area, this is unbelievable what's happened in genetics over the last decade. You know what Moore's law is? It's a term that's used a lot in the IT industry and it's about 3 decades old. Moore's law is this green line, which suggests that in the semiconductor world, we'll be able to double the amount of information we put on a chip every 2 years. And for a long time, that has been the gold standard for thinking about innovation and how fast technology is moving. Relative to that, look what's happened in genomics. The Human Genome Project was completed about a decade ago, and at that point, it took us about $3.5 billion in 10 to 12 years to sequence the first human genome. At that point, in 2001, 2002, if you wanted to sequence 1 million bases of DNA, which is what this is, a megabase, it would have cost you about $5,286. Today, that's about 19 cents. And instead of taking a decade to do a whole genome sequence, today we're very close to getting to the point where we can do a whole genome, not for $3.5 billion in a decade, but for about $1,000 over the course of a week or so. What's really awful about this is people my age who spent 3 or 4 years doing genetics on a project that now anybody would do in an afternoon. So some of us in my generation feel like we were just born way too early to be able to do the kind of science that we would love to do. All of this is just a way of saying that we now have the ability to do genetics faster, better, cheaper than we could have even imagined even 5 years ago. And you can see it's been about 5 years since we've had this enormous change in the cost and the throughput. So that's given us the ability to interrogate these very common variants that are found in the genome. And when you do this, this funky slide is just mapping all the chromosomes across here and across here, and looking at where the points of variation are that are associated with any medical disorders. And we now know this is about a year old. There are more of them every week. At this point, we were up to 1,300, but they're probably closer to 2,000 now, associated with lots of different medical disorders. Now, we had great hopes that this would help us to understand the genetic risk for schizophrenia, autism, and bipolar disorder. I showed you they were highly heritable. So at least as heritable as Crohn's disease or hypertension or type 1 diabetes, for which we've found many, many of these hits. But sadly, there have been very few. Now, there are a few that have shown up, and I show a couple of them here, but it's a handful. Not the harvest that we would have expected. There are 55 or 60 for type 1 diabetes. They're about the same number for type 2 diabetes. By the way, there's no overlap, completely different biology for those two diseases. But we're down to like 2 or 3 for autism, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 for schizophrenia. Very small numbers, which is really striking when you consider how heritable they are. There are a few others, and we could argue about some of these, that are much less common and seem to have a much more, possibly a greater impact. But the real shocker in the case of mental disorders came about 2 or 3 years ago when we began to realize that there were a whole bunch of these very high impact but rare lesions in the genome. Some of these weren't just a single base that was changed, but a whole, like 1 million bases that were duplicated or deleted, sometimes quadruplicated. We call these copy number variations because it's a whole chunk of DNA, a whole chunk of a chromosome that gets repeated for reasons that we don't understand. Now, sometimes it happens and there's no ill effects, but it's 10 times more likely in people who have schizophrenia or autism, and probably in bipolar as well. What's weird about that is that there's so many of them, and they're really nonspecific. So you can find the same area of structural variation in autism and in schizophrenia. It's very clear that nature never read DSM-3, 4, or 5, and that genetics is going to give us a very different picture of the biology of these illnesses. Some of them you find in the person with the disorder, but not in either parent, suggesting that these are new variants. They're new lesions that occur in the creation of that individual. So we call that de novo. So this is weird because it says, gosh, something can be genetic but not be inherited. We never thought of it that way. And really striking is that some of these we call private mutations because they're so individually rare. In fact, they can be found in a single family. that there are a lot of geneticists in this field who go around quoting Tolstoy for this famous quote. And it does make you think about that when you look at these very rare mutations in which it seems like every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way, because these are, in fact, some of them appear to be private. Now, how do we think about what these are doing? Did the genes cause the disease? No. Are the genes setting up some kind of risk? Potentially. How would that happen? Well, remember, these are developmental. And what do genes do? They code for proteins. And what are proteins important for? They're important for creating cells that become circuits. And so the way we think about this increasingly is that you have all this genetic variation that may not map onto schizophrenia or depression, but it maps onto brain circuits, the very circuits that we talked about at the beginning. And those in turn link to various cognitive and emotional domains like episodic memory, reward, emotional regulation, which then bias people to end up in one of these things that we call a disorder. Absolutely essential in trying to understand this is to realize that genes are still a limited part of the story, and that experience, especially prenatal experience or prenatal exposure, can have an enormous impact on how this transition takes place, how genes begin to specify circuits, and how genetic variation works either for vulnerability or resilience. So those are the three major issues I wanted to raise with you in terms of thinking about these disorders in a new way. The implication of this is that we actually now have to take this kind of science, which is very different than saying we're only going to be about behavior, or we're only going to try to understand this psychologically. We're now bringing in lots of other kinds of science, genetics, neuroscience, some very interesting cognitive science, and we're beginning to say, how does that not only change the way we think about the disorders, but fundamentally, what does this do for diagnosis? What does it do for treatment? And what does it mean about how we train people for the next generation? So I want to say a couple of words about each of those. Let's talk about diagnosis first. I said before how odd it is that this is a field that still has limited itself to one level of analysis, really just thinking about diagnosis based on observation of symptoms. Now, actually, we did that in virtually every part of medicine 100 years ago, but most areas have moved on. Hard for that to happen in the study of depression or schizophrenia if these are brain disorders and you haven't any real way to look at what the brain is doing. But now we do. And so now we can begin to actually look at all of these levels of analysis, from genes to molecules, cells, circuits, physiology, behavior, and begin to ask of those many levels, along with cognition, how would you build the framework? How does the brain separate out psychopathology or affective pathology? And letting the biology tell us how to cut this up, rather than what we do today, which is you bring a bunch of very experienced clinicians into a room and you have them vote. So, in DSM, the diagnosis of depression is based on 9 criteria. You have to have 5 for at least 2 weeks. That means that 2 of us could have 1 out of 9 in common and have the same label. Not surprising that it's been really difficult for this field to move forward, because we've been so limited in the kinds of data that we've been able to bring even to our diagnostic schemes. And this is especially compelling now because we have such great technology at every one of these levels that we can begin to understand with real precision, real depth, what may be going on, either in humans or in model animals when we identify a particular genetic variant and try to understand what that does. So there's a great opportunity here, but not one that's been fully realized. I often like to tell this story of something I read years ago, which really had a big impact on me when I was when I first came to NIMH, and I had been I trained as a psychiatrist and then basically dropped out for 20 years to do neuroscience. So I was a bench scientist working in a laboratory for 2 decades. And then I came back to do this job. And I was trying to catch up and figure out what was going on. And then I began to realize very quickly, not very much had changed in 20 years for a lot of what we did clinically. But I began reading a lot. And I was really struck by the problem we were having in the categories we used, because it just seemed to me that we were so fixed on the names that we were putting on things as if they were real, even though these were just labels, they were constructs. And we couldn't then question them. So I saw this paper that came out that really intrigued me. It was a paper about this particular butterfly called the tropical skipper, a very common butterfly in Latin America. And it was being studied by a group of entomologists. It had been studied for about 3 decades. And people had noticed that it has a fairly uninteresting phenotype in terms of the kinds of things it does as a tropical species. Well, when people began to look at it developmentally in the way I'm suggesting you have to do to understand these disorders, they found a surprising thing. They found out that this one butterfly was actually the result of 10 different caterpillars, actually 10 different species. They shared the same adult morph, the same adult form, but genetically and developmentally they were completely different. And that metaphor really began to hit me, that we have got to be thinking or rethinking these disorders if we're going to do it developmentally, with the possibility that when we talk about autism, it's really many, many different things. And one of the reasons we haven't been able to make progress is we keep thinking it's just the single tropical skipper instead of breaking it up into the 10 different forms that it might actually be. What about treatment? Well, we put out a report, a strategic plan about 3 or 4 years ago now, that focused on what needed to happen in treatment. And we talked about it, how it had to be more pathophysiologically based. We had to get there earlier, that's the preemptive, figuring out who would respond to what, the personalized treatment, and then to develop treatments that would have much greater public health impact. But the reality is that we don't really know how to do that yet. We have a lot we have to learn. And in the case of medications, where we've had almost no innovation, we've actually done better for behavioral and cognitive treatments, where we begin to see really interesting, innovative, and some devices that are coming along. They're pretty exciting and seem to have some really interesting impact. For medications, we had a fantastic set of compounds in the 1960s, and we really haven't gone much beyond that. And they've gotten less interesting as the years have gone on. It's worth noting, though, it's not just psychiatry, but in medicine in general, we don't do so well. This is a little hard to read. This says 250 compounds when you get into clinical trials, down to about 1 drug approved. So there's like a, less than a 1% chance of success for a project that takes some 14 years and costs about $1.8 to $2 billion per drug. So this is not the recipe for success that you might want in terms of developing new medications. So we've been thinking about how that might also need to be rethought, or how it could be transformed. This is the basic pipeline for drug development in cancer, heart disease, and as well as for mental disorders. And the place that we really have to focus in this field is to understand what the targets are down here. We used to think that maybe serotonin was the target for depression and dopamine for schizophrenia, but if that were the case, it would be hard to argue, now that we have drugs that hit those targets, why we haven't been able to get better outcomes. So we have to back up and have a better understanding of what other targets might be helpful, and to begin to think about this with what we call experimental medicine, which is actually developing compounds to validate targets rather than thinking so much about the next generation of drugs. Actually spending the time to understand much more about the biology of the disorders rather than worrying right now about developing the next blockbuster drug. The other possibility is that almost everything we have now, at least the original forms of them, like Thorazine and the original antidepressants, were developed by accident. They were really just a serendipitous observation of something that was being used for another purpose. It was an antihistamine, it was a sedative, it was something else that turned out to be useful for someone who was psychotic or who was depressed. We used to sort of dismiss that as being, it's just serendipity. Well, actually, that's the way a lot of really great discoveries in medicine have happened, just in that way, a very keen clinical insight. And so we're increasingly interested in how to do this. It's called repurposing. But instead of just leaving this to chance, how to crowdsource or systematize the way that we can figure out which of the 3,870 compounds that are now available worldwide for therapeutic use might have some effect on this group of disorders. And so we've begun to come up with approaches to that, which I think are going to really change the way we do treatment development. Training. Well, everything I've told you so far will be, for psychiatrists in the room, for some, would be surprising, and for psychologists would probably be upsetting, and for social workers, depressing, because this is not the way the mental health workforce has been trained. But it will be. And what I'm going to argue is that the 21st century has to come up with a new discipline. And we've done this before in medicine. We haven't done it recently, but medicine has generated new disciplines as new intellectual foundations and new technologies have come online. In this case, we've got the makings of it through all of these currently existing disciplines. And what I'm going to suggest to you is that we need something called clinical neuroscience, which will bring people who are interested in behavior, who are interested in the mind, but also well-schooled in understanding the brain and how to think about it, and at least cognizant of genetics and biology and all of these other areas together, so that we can create a workforce that actually has the ability to take on these very complex problems. So last point, just to summarize what I've told you, I want to suggest to you that when I started, I gave you some really dire statistics about where this field is and how, as a field, we have failed people who really need help. The highest morbidity, some of the highest mortality, and enormous economic impact. What I want to suggest now is that we can do this, and we can do it by first recognizing how serious the problem is, realizing that where we are now is unacceptable, but that we have all of the tools we need to get to the pathophysiology, to understand the mechanisms of disease for these disorders. I'd already laid them out for you. They're at each of these levels. We've got amazing opportunities. That will get us part of the way. It'll get us to biodiagnostics, just like we use in the rest of medicine. It'll get us, we hope, to at least knowing what the core pathology or what the targets ought to be and having treatments for those purposes. Where we want to be, of course, is being able to guide those with precision to what each individual needs, what we call personalized or precision care. And there, too, we have the technologies. Some of them have to do with changing the way we do diagnosis. Some have to do with this experimental medicine. And the goal, ultimately, is right here: strategic prevention, recovery, and cure. Now, this is like, you're probably thinking I need to go back on my lithium. I mean, this may not seem like it has any basis in reality, but let me emphasize this point. We have in hand the tools to do every piece of this, and they're right here. I've just told you about almost all of them. And the reason I'm so confident about that is we've already done it. We've done it in almost every other area of medicine. And we'll do it here as well. But we'll only do it if we have the workforce to do it, we ask the right questions, and we bring really creative ideas and powerful technologies to the table. Important to note that that's only part of the battle. That at the end of the day, if all we've done is make the treatments more expensive and less accessible, that's not success. So dissemination, providing access, coordinating care, huge issues for this space, and topic for a whole other lecture, which I'll give if I'm ever invited back, because that is actually, in this area, even more critical. So much of mental health care is actually outside of health care. We call it behavioral health, which is sort of separate and not equal. And so part of what the challenge will be over the next decade or two through parity and healthcare reform is the integration of mental health care with healthcare so that we can make sure that as we fix this for healthcare, we fix it for mental health care as well. So let me stop there and suggest to you that even though I started off with some rather depressing facts and figures and what I sometimes call kind of inescapable or kind of uncomfortable facts, I do think that the potential is fantastic, but it's going to require getting a lot of very energetic, smart young people working in this area to really, I would say, begin a revolution so that we can rethink these disorders and come up with better diagnosis, better treatments, and ultimately cures. Thank you very much.
The role of infectious diseases in the development of mental illness. Recently, there's been quite a number of publications calling attention to this, but you did not mention any of it. Is that because you don't believe in it, or it's too early to say about it?
I'm sorry, I missed, if you could just repeat the last part of that.
The role of infectious diseases in the development of mental illness. There has been some recent literature on this and interest, and I didn't see it mentioned today.
Yeah, so the role of infectious diseases, is that the question? Yeah, I think it's a really interesting hypothesis. We don't have fantastic data across the whole spectrum, but there have been lots of possibilities raised, especially for viral infections prenatally and sometimes viruses that are not well known that could be associated. There's a lot of interest, for instance, in toxoplasmosis. I hasten to point out that while some people find this idea that infectious causes could be sort of unusual, 100 years ago, one of the most common causes of what was then called schizophrenia or psychosis was tertiary syphilis, general paresis. And we forget about that now because we don't see it very often. When I was a resident, my long-term psychoanalytic case was somebody with peptic ulcer disease. We treat that in a week with triple therapy. Helicobacter is the cause of that. So it's worth thinking about this. The most recent version of this is with childhood obsessive-compulsive disorder, which in some fraction of cases appears to be a sequela to a strep infection. And we have some children who have kept on penicillin long-term do very, very well. So I think we know very little here about infectious agents as causative agents, and gosh, it's an open field still.
I have a question, perhaps it digresses a little bit from the thrust of your presentation, but if you could address the stage 4 for people who actually work, or as I do tangentially, in mental health with current patients, I read that we typify that the ideal mental health patient in a clinical, in an institutional environment is one that's complacent, that follows orders and is nonviolent, and that essentially assures that they continue to be institutionalized for long periods of time, the rest of their life, and do not meet the goal of socializing and going into the environment.
Yeah, so questions about what's expected, or what are the expectations for people who are institutionalized? Was that the question, or?
And how to address this typical patient
okay.
who becomes institutionalized and is a good patient,
yeah,
the one who never finds a cure.
Thank you. If a good patient in an institutional setting is someone who's placid and doesn't cause a problem, it's probably not well known here, so I should clarify that there are no institutions any longer, or very, very few. There are very, very few beds in the United States for people with psychiatric illness. 1970, there were 600,000, and 2010, less than 50,000. So there's more than a 90% decrease. And the issue is that when people require institutionalization today, in most states, they don't go to a health center. They may go to an emergency room. More often, they end up in the criminal justice system. In the United States, this is just an astounding fact. The prisons and jails have become the de facto mental health institutions. The largest mental health institution in this city is Cook County Jail. The largest mental health institution in Los Angeles is LA County Jail. And that's not something we should be proud of, because people don't get optimal care in that environment, but there are very few beds for people who are actively psychotic and out of control. That's a recent finding. I mean, that wasn't true even 15 years ago, but it's the case now. So we have a real crisis in this country about what happens to people who need institutional care. But your point about what happens to them when they're in institutions, I think, was more of an issue 3 decades ago. Today, it just doesn't happen very often. There are just so few people who are able to be in beds. In my state, we're down to just a handful of state beds, and those are left for people who have a history of sexual crimes as well as mental illness, and they just can't. They can't be placed anywhere else, and so and even those beds are being taken away. So it's actually, the problem is going just the opposite way. We actually need institutional care for people who are a danger to themselves or others.
Is it my turn? Hello. Dr. Insel?
Yes.
I think you referred to the fact that you began your lecture with some negative comments. And in that mode, I think you also said that since the 1960s, there have been fewer, if any, significant advances in medications for psychiatric illnesses. So I just want to know if you would look at that from a different perspective. Could you also say that there have been some significant advances in psychiatric medication since the 1960s?
Yeah, so I would I'd put it this way. I think there have been for some people, some real revolutionary advances. And I think the one that comes to mind is clozapine. So it's an antipsychotic. We don't exactly know how it works, but there's no question that there are patients who don't respond to anything else who really respond to this. Maybe 10%, 15% of patients, it's life-changing. It's just dramatic. And it's clear that even in the 1960s or early 70s, we had a number of really powerful agents that were life-saving. Lithium, it's a fantastic compound. Antipsychotics, which are probably necessary but not sufficient. And the antidepressants. What I was trying to convey is that since that time, with the exception of clozapine, it's hard for me to say that we've developed any antidepressant, for instance, that is more effective than the ones we had 40 years ago. There's been a lot of new compounds, and they have been marketed with exuberance, and they've sold very successfully to the point now where something like 1 in 10 Americans has received a prescription for an antidepressant. But I don't see any shift in the mortality from depression, in the number of people getting a diagnosis of depression. And in most areas of medicine, if you have something that's really effective, you see a reduction, not an increase in prevalence and mortality. So it's hard for me to believe that these things are as good as they're marketed to be.
I got to jump in. I have to talk.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Over here. Doctor,
Speak.
nice to meet you. I'm sorry. Starters, I'm a social worker. So I'm one of the ones who you're going to, make me lose my job. I work in a psychosocial rehabilitation and recovery center with people with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, some major depressive disorder. And one of the things that struck me is it feels very scientifically reductionist. I don't know how to put that. I am so for genetic research and research, especially with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. But I think that you can't ignore there is a huge element of experience in our society and culture that impacts mental illness. And just the mere fact, and I don't have data offhand, but that other countries have better rates of, not recovery necessarily in a medical sense, for schizophrenia than we do because of their attitudes towards schizophrenia. I think that we, the pathologizing of the illness in our country is not helpful. Let me see, I think that was all I want to say. Oh, and you mentioned the medications for major depressive disorder. Well, you showed in your slide that there is not as strong of an evidence that that's genetically based, that what you're proposing to address these issues would not necessarily work as well with major depressive disorder. So at least social workers can keep that, okay? Maybe anxiety, little anxiety, borderline personality disorder. That's our territory. Thank you.
So thank you. So let me clarify, because I think it's very, very helpful. And I deeply agree with one thing you said and deeply disagree with another. So the part I agree with is the importance of understanding not just experience, but incorporating that into what we do for interventions, and that a psychosocial perspective is absolutely critical for recovery. In fact, I think I said this in passing, that where some of the best outcomes and best innovations have been exactly in that space. And what's, to me, so pathetic is that we don't support it, we don't disseminate it, we don't require it. There is no question that if we take the things we know are helpful, ACT teams, supported employment, working on better housing, peer support, all these things we know are incredibly powerful and effective, and we just do them, we get much, much better outcomes. No question about it. So that's an important piece of this. And by the way, it's not unique to this group of disorders. It's also true for the care of diabetes and the care of heart disease, for almost all medical problems. Medicine is a maybe necessary but not sufficient part of a treatment plan. In this case, the rest of the treatment plan, we have much better evidence for, and it's really very impressive. Where I disagree with you is the sense that in those countries where this isn't as pathologized, the outcomes are better. I think actually the problem we've had is that we haven't taken these disorders seriously. And I think what we've tended to do is to say that they're somehow different than cancer or different than fatal forms of heart disease, and they don't require the same kind of effort. People in this field talk a lot about stigma, but it's us. We're the problem. We don't take this seriously. And until we say, these are fatal illnesses, and we have to bring everything we can to bear to keep people from dying at age 56, to make sure that there are less than 36,000 suicides, we're not going to move the needle. It's amazing. In the Army today, they lose more people, more soldiers to suicide than combat. That's been true for 2 years, 3 years. And they take this very seriously. But you don't see that anywhere else. If you ask the Secretary of Defense or the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, what's going on with suicide in the Army, he will literally take a piece of paper out of his breast pocket and he'll read you the names of who's killed themselves in the last week, because he's talked to every one of their families. Now, if you ask me what is the suicide rate in the United States, I'll give you data from 2009, which is the most recent information we have. And there is not a governor, a mayor, or anyone in this country, in the civilian society, who's engaged like that. So the rate will go down in the Army, I have no doubt, because they take it seriously. But that doesn't happen anywhere else. Go ahead.
Just a quick question. I was wondering, could you give a couple comments about the direction that you think psychology and social work training ought to take?
Yeah, I think that for all and I wouldn't separate out any of these. I think that Psychology and social work, for one thing, the needs are still enormous. So if you look at those psychosocial treatments and cognitive behavioral treatments that we have, believe it or not, most psychologists and social workers are still not getting supervised training in those in 2011. We did a survey in 2009 or 2008, and less than 20% of social work programs in the United States that we looked at were providing supervised training in any evidence-based psychotherapy. We do have evidence-based psychotherapies, nobody learns how to do them. Psychology is a complicated and more difficult issue because it's so many different disciplines. And there are people who are called psychologists who have very deep and scientific training and know how to do evidence-based practices and know how to create evidence-based psychotherapies. And there are people who are doing swimming with dolphins, and that's what they were taught to do, and that's all they'll ever do. And we have to think about how we accredit and how we account for. If we expect Medicaid to, and we have parity in this country, and we expect those things to be reimbursed, we're going to have to up the game. And I think all of us are going to have the responsibility of figuring out how to do that. If we don't do that, it will be in a much worse place for the kinds of therapies that actually do work that aren't going to be given, aren't going to be reimbursed for.
I know there are a lot more questions that people have. You'll have a great chance to ask those questions of Dr. Insel during the reception. But before we break for that, let me just say there's a number of people that we need to thank. We have in the audience Mel Bloom, who is one of the trustees of the Silverstein Foundation, and so his efforts help keep this going. Dr. Peter Kopp is the interim director of the Center for Genetic Medicine, and he's been vital at keeping this going and keeping these kind of events going. And finally, the staff of CGM, as in particular, Megan Boyle and Nell Wasserstrom, were just superb in organizing this visit. So let's thank them and Dr. Insel, and then join us for the reception. Thank you.